So, OP09 comes out on Friday. It's finally here. The 8.5 format feels like it's been forever. Pretty much just an extension of the 08 format with the addition of Doflamingo and Purple Luffy, kind of. 09 can be a much bigger shake-up. One of the biggest shake-ups we've seen in a long time, in my opinion. Probably since set 7, or even longer, maybe. So, we've got these are the leaders that I would consider to be at least viable rogue picks. Obviously, all of these leaders can win your locals. There'll be many leaders that I haven't mentioned that could win your locals. I'm mainly focusing on those higher tier events, those regionals, those treasure cups. And we're going to go over each of these, talk about the new matchups against the new leaders. And what better place to start than with the main man of the new leaders himself, Blackbeard. I think Blackbeard is going to comfortably slot into tier 1. We saw in Japan that this leader took quite a while for the Japanese players to figure out. It's a very new playstyle to One Piece. Lots of these decks, look at these other leaders, right? So many of them rely on their on-plays. And building a deck that doesn't have on-plays was a challenge in itself. And then finding how to adapt that to combat the meta took quite a while. But eventually, we saw this guy take over. He was winning tournament after tournament after tournament, topping everything. It was pretty crazy. And he looks to get even better in set 10. So I'm going to put him in tier 1 for now. I think against the other top decks from the previous format, your Dofi matchup is not amazing, but it's absolutely winnable. I don't think it's atrocious. Your Lucci matchup is great because they really need their on plays to KO you. They're having to tech things like 9-cost Kaido and more copies of 7-cost Jack just to have the chance to interact with you, because their Morias just don't work, which is really bad. Against Enel, it's like a free win because your 10-cost Teach turns off their leader effect, which is super debilitating, right? The other top tier matchups, Purple Luffy, I think, is one of the deck's tougher matchups. And I also think Shanks is a tougher matchup. They play out these bigger bodies, don't necessarily rely on their on-plays. Things like Sangoro, he doesn't really care about his on-play, he doesn't have one. Into Kid blocker as well, really good board presence. Harder to remove, you've got to find that Laboon or the finger gun, which are unsearchable. Against Shanks, they've got things like Roger, like the big Shanks. They've got Dragon. Dragon doesn't get his on play, but he still gets Rush, and Rush into Blackbeard is crazy. So I think Blackbeard is going to be sort of a little bit of matchup roulette, but I think you've got enough really strong matchups that he's going to be comfortably in tier 1. You also have a really nice Nami matchup, which is always a huge benefit for me. The rest of the new leaders, I don't think are quite as strong. I think the next best is probably going to be Shanks. I think I'm going to put Shanks really near the top of tier 1.5. I think this deck is very strong into most decks. You don't have any crazy favourable matchups. You don't have any crazy unfavourable ones either. I think something like Lucci could be one of your tougher matchups. But we've seen the builds adapting to that, right? They're playing the Marco, they're playing the Ace. So you've got these bodies. They're not the biggest, they're not the scariest, but Lucci can't remove them. And anything that Lucci can't remove is incredible. I also think your Purple Luffy matchup can be a little iffy. But if you're able to stabilize in that late game, not get too far behind, it's okay. I think your matchups into other decks, your Doflamingo matchup, you can tech for this as much as you like. There are so many cards in red now that are good into Doflamingo. You've got Ben Beckman, you've got Newgate, you've got Rayleigh, even Lucky Roo, if they can't bounce it with Law, is incredible. And then late game, that 10-cost Shanks debuffing all their dudes by 1,000 is wild. If they've got 4 or 5 guys on the board, not so good. But if you're able to limit their board to just sort of 2 to 3 characters, then play that Shanks, rush in, get rid of one of them, you're in a pretty good spot. You are in a pretty good spot. Into BY Luffy, we didn't actually talk about this with Blackbeard either, I think. So Blackbeard just turns off pretty much the entire deck of BY Luffy. They can use their baby brothers because they're activate main. You can't use Moria, can't use Sabo. It's really not good. It's really not good. And Shanks into BY, you've got the big Rush Shanks, you've got the Roger, you've got Dragon, you've got so many big units that Luffy hates to see. I think it's pretty good. So who else have we got? We've got Lim. I think Lim is unfortunately so far going to be a rogue deck. We've seen some of the new reveals from OP10. And Lim seems to be doing a little bit better out in Japan with the set 10 cards. But I think for now, it's going to be Rogue. The guys coming in tapped is still super bad. And you're just generically a worse deck than a lot of these other top leaders as well, which isn't helpful. Buggy, I think, is also going to be a Rogue deck. I think he's probably better than Lim. Once we get the shoe promo, whatever you want to call it, I think this will rise up maybe to top of tier 2. But for now, your Doflamingo matchup is horrendous. Your Blackbeard matchup is weird, because it's not great, but if they use their effect, you can just play 10 cost Buggy, which is kind of funny. Your matchup into Purple Luffy is not great. They're really fast, and you can't really deal with it. Shanks, too, can be tough. I think BY Luffy's not too bad. Because you're blue, you can Raging Tiger their dudes, right? But outside of that, I think Buggy sort of doesn't have the best matchups. Having basically an auto loss into Doflamingo is atrocious. Absolutely atrocious. And I think that's enough to just put him in Rogue for now. Purple Black Luffy, I think is a tier 2 deck. He's probably the weakest of the 3 purple Luffys we have. But I think he still has something to say. Gecko Moria into a bunch of value is still really good. And you're a great use of Nika. You're probably the Luffy that uses Nika the best. And Nika's a crazy card, right? There are builds of this that are just playing for Nika and rushing to play him as soon as possible, which is amusing. That new Roronoa Zoro is crazy. There's also just a few other cards that this deck gets access to that other decks don't. They're just really strong. You get crazy value out of the Rush Luffy, the Rush Sanji. It's good. It's a good deck. Just I don't think having 4 life is too big a downside for what you get from Black. What you get from Black is basically Moria, maybe 5 cost Sanji, maybe a couple other cards if you like. You don't gain enough to warrant being 2 colors. I think if this was mono purple, this would be in contention with the other mono purple Luffy, for which is the best one. Next up, we've got Robin. Robin is also definitely going to be a Rogue pick. I do think she is better than these other 2 because you have access to Gum Giant. You have access to all the broken yellow cards, Yamato Ace. Obviously, these cards aren't great into Teach, but Banish is great into Teach, right? They need their resources to stop your on plays, and just having Banish, stopping them drawing so many cards, is genuinely really scary for them. They're going to have so many less resources throughout the game, especially if they want to use their leader effect soon, which they will against a yellow deck because you're playing cards like Godatsu and Nami. It's not a crazy good matchup, honestly. The Banish is spooky. That's all the new decks. That's all 6 of those. Let me know what you think of those rankings. I think they're pretty uncontroversial. I think this is where they're going to settle. I could see Shanks bottom of tier 1, maybe. But beyond that, I think this is pretty accurate. The other deck that we haven't ranked ever is this Sanji. I think he's a Rogue deck. I think he is going to be worse than all of these. You've got the 2 schools, right? You've got the school of thought that's just playing the vanilla rushdown. I think that deck's shit. I think the build is way too flimsy to blockers, way too flimsy to removal, and is just not good. And the other build is sort of the more techie build, playing things like Shaka, playing things like Wapol. I think that build is a bit better. It's more interesting as well. I still don't think it's good. I think you just really struggle to keep up with these decks. Shanks is tough. Obviously, your Teach matchup's great because you don't play on plays anyway, and all your guys having Rush is amazing. I think some of these other top tier matchups, things like Black Yellow Luffy, are tough. Lucci is tough, and Shanks is going to be a tough matchup. Doflamingo as well, they're just going to rush you down. They just don't care about your board. In terms of the other top tier decks, we'll go and place them first. I think Doflamingo is going to be the best deck in the game. If you look at the Japanese results, they very much suggest that Doflamingo is the best deck in the game. Last format, we had Black Yellow Luffy topping the charts. I think Black Yellow Luffy takes a big hit. They don't love Shanks. They really don't love Teach. And I think the buffs to other leaders around them generally makes them stronger. Lucci was one of your best matchups. Lucci's a bit weaker, so you're not thrilled about that. Some of your other tougher matchups, like Purple Luffy, could be a tougher matchup. Is even worse now because they've got even more big units that they want to play in the 9-cost Luffy. It could be pretty tricky, right? And speaking of Black Yellow Luffy, we'll place him now, I guess. I think he's going to be tier 1.5. I do think he's going to be very high on tier 1.5 You still have a good time into Lucci. You still have an okay time into Purple Luffy, even if I do think it is favoured for Purple Luffy. You have still a decent to strong matchup into Doflamingo. That hasn't really changed at all. But your Teach matchup, having no on-plays is shocking. I think Shanks is just going to go really tall. They have Roger. So if you're ever not able to stick at 1, you just lose, which is not great. I do think Blackbeard Luffy is finally going to get a bit weaker, which I'm thrilled to see. Another top deck from last format is Lucci. I think Lucci will be able to adapt to Teach. You just have to play a few Kaidos and then you can deal with their top end. I think what's going to be harder to deal with is the mid-range. Dealing with things like Laboons and Van Augers is going to be tougher, because if they're turning off your on-plays in that mid-game, you can't use your Moria, you can't use Lucci, Rebecca, Kaku, anything like that. Your removal is really limited to things like Brooks attacking. Not great, but I do think he'll be able to adapt to Teach. But I feel it will make him a little bit weak into Doflamingo. I think Shanks could be a decent matchup for you, because they're only playing one dude a turn. Just going to be determined by how many of those sticky guys they see. You know, the Marco, the Ace. Your BY Luffy matchup is still horrendous. I think your Purple Luffy matchup will get better, because more and more of them are cutting Magellan. And that matchup, Magellan was like the card you didn't want to see. Everything else was okay, sometimes scary, but manageable. Magellan was just horrible for Lucci to see. I think the removal of Magellan from most Purple Luffy decks will make that matchup a bit easier. Speaking of Purple Luffy, I think this is going to be the third best deck in the game. Haven't really seen this out in Japan, but I don't know, people in the West really like Purple Luffy, and I think people will be able to make a really good list of this. I think this deck has a lot of promise. Gum Giant is a ridiculous card that keeps you going forever. You're decent into Teach, okay into Doflamingo, but I do think Doflamingo is a tough matchup for Purple Luffy. Your Shanks matchup is sort of close. Your BY matchup I think is favourable now. Lucci, if you want to tech for Lucci, you can play things like Magellan, okay. And then into some of the other decks, you know, your tier 2 decks, I think you're just generically better than. You will have tough matchups here and there, but I think Purple Luffy has a lot to say in this format, and I do think it will be tier 1. Next up, we'll tackle Nami. I think Nami is going to be probably the best deck in tier 2. It will see placements, there's Nami specialists everywhere. I think Nami is decent. You have a tough time into Dofi and Purple Luffy. And to be honest, you have a tough time into all of these tier 1 matchups. Teach, turning off your leader effect with their top end, pretty scary. They also have the Doc Q that can pretty efficiently remove your Kayas and your 1-cost Namis, which isn't great. I think you do absolutely have the chance to rush Teach down, but not being able to use Kaya in that matchup, or Marguerite, because of the Teach's leader effect, cutting down your on-plays, I think is a massive deficit, and honestly, potentially even more impactful than the 10-cost Teach turning off your leader effect. But yeah, I do think some of these slightly outside of tier 1 matchups are still going to be good. You're still going to have a good time into Lucci. You're still going to have a decent time into Luffy. I think Shanks could go either way, depends how much rush they play. But they're generally quite a slow deck. They're not trying to aggro you down, so I think Shanks could be a reasonable matchup. You match up into some of the other future tier 2 decks. You know, things like Smoker and Enel are still good. You match up into Bonnie. Has always just been how many Hodis and Zoros they see. That's not going to change. Do you think Nami is in a okay spot? I think she's just going to struggle with these top decks, and I think that's enough to push her down to tier 2. Last format, definitely tier 1.5. I think this format, probably a tier 2 deck. Next up, we're going to cover Bonnie. I think Bonnie's going to be very bottom of tier 1.5. Your Teach matchup is going to be pretty tough. You do need those on plays. Your Cavendish, your Carrot, your 10-cost Dofi, all very important on plays. Yes, you have Kid. They can remove Kid and also just attack into it with the big Blackbeard. I think it is going to be reasonably hard. Also, the big Blackbeard negating your leader effect is quite impactful in this matchup, because then you can't rest something so they get an extra attack. I do think this will be a pretty tough matchup. Dofi is fine. You're fine into Dofi with Bonnie. We've sort of worked that matchup out. We've got Kid, we've got Carrot, all good. Purple Luffy, I think, will be a little tougher, just because they're that bit faster than Doflamingo. Yes, Dofi's playing a lot of 4s. Those are easier to deal with than a whole bunch of 5s, 6s, and 7s. I think Luffy is going to be a tougher matchup than Dofi for Bonnie. Bonnie into Shanks is atrocious. Shanks is really good into Bonnie. The Rush Shanks, the KO Shanks, both incredible cards, especially the KO Shanks. Just clearing Doflamingo whilst establishing a 10-12 is wild. These other matchups are unchanged. We know how they are. I think we'll cover Enel. He's going to be bottom of tier 2. The Teach matchup is atrocious. The Purple Luffy matchup is pretty bad. The Blue Dofi matchup is still really good for you though. Shanks can go either way. If you see enough Rygos, you can maybe deal with them. They've got so much top end, it's pretty spooky. And these other matchups are mostly unchanged. I think one deck that is sort of new and coming back is going to be Red Purple Luffy. I think this deck kind of has decent matchups across the board. I think the Purple Luffy and the Blue Dofi are some of your harder matchups. But gaining so many of these new cards, the 9-cost Rush Luffy, the Yasop, are really good for a deck like this that just thrives on making your leader as big as possible for as little effort as possible. Gum Gum Giant is also, as we know, a ridiculous card. Absolutely ridiculous. This deck makes incredible use of Gum Gum Giant, and I think that's a really good reason to play Red Purple Luffy. I don't think any of your matchups are too crazy either way. Dofi can be tough, but it just depends how many 6k bodies they hit. And the same with Purple Luffy. Purple Luffy can be one of the tougher matchups, but it's still manageable. If you can make your leader big enough, you can stifle their early aggression, and then catch up to them in the late game by playing your big dudes, like the Rush Luffy, and like Newgate. Smoker, I think, is going to be a tier 2 deck. He's still just roughly a worse version of Lucci. Your Tashigi, whilst being an Activate main, is not really an Activate main because you need the on-play -4 for it to do much of anything. I think your Teach matchup is still going to be tough. Your matchup into the Purple Luffy is also going to be tough. You have a worse matchup into Dofi than Lucci. But like generically, all these matchups are fine. They're reasonably close to 50-50s. Smoker doesn't have any shocking matchups, but he also doesn't have any crazy favourable ones. He's just a worse version of Lucci, but I think that's still good enough to be near the top of tier 2. I also think this other black deck, the Start Deck 14 Luffy, will be around the same place as Smoker. They do similar things. Luffy just becomes a bigger leader, and Smoker has access to a couple of other cards. That Tashigi is crazy, but being a 6k leader is no joke. I think these decks have their pluses and their minuses over each other. I think they're in roughly the same spot. We'll quick fire through some of these other rogue decks. I think Katakuri is going to be probably the top deck in rogue. It's fine. Katakuri is always fine. Just kind of boring and not very good. The better the players you play against, the worse it gets. But you can absolutely still sack people with this. It's whatever. I think the Zoro is going to be probably worse than Sanji. He's fine. You can play Zoro if you like. The Zero build is still there. It's not great into Teach because you don't get the on-play of the Chopper. And without going wide, this deck's not very good. But I think there's still something to be said there. I mean, the aggro pressure is crazy. Into some of these decks that are a little slower, like a Lucci that doesn't draw too well, Mocha, you can be pretty good. Law, I think, is in a similar state to Zoro and Sanji. I'd probably put him slightly above Zoro. You don't like Teach. You have a ton of on-plays as Law. Your entire deck is on-plays, pretty much. So you don't love Teach. But other than that, this deck's matchups are mostly unchanged. You're probably not great into Shanks, just because they have a decent bit of removal, and the 5-cost Marco actually is really good into you. But I think he's probably better than Zoro, just because you've got a few more options. Below Betty, I think warrants a spot in tier 2. I think she'll be decent. It's just matchup roulette, right? If you match up into a bunch of Teachers, maybe even a bunch of BYs, you're going to have a good time. If all you find is Doflamingo and Lucci, it's not going to be a great time for you. I think Below Betty is just a gambling deck. You could win a tournament with this, but, you know, it's not going to be the easiest. Corona, I think, is pretty bad. I think this deck's kind of shit. I don't really understand why people like it so much. I don't think the playstyle's that fun. You're basically just hard relying on finding 2 to 3 Ryumas and also 2 to 3 Morias in every single game. You don't see those. The deck is just absolute dog shit. You do get to run Zoro, which is quite nice, into things like BY, into Nami as well. But I think this is just miles worse than all these other black leaders. And for that reason, I'm putting him near the bottom. Yamato as well is another cope deck. This deck's shit. This deck's boring. I don't know why people like this. It's one of the least skilled decks in the game, in my opinion. And that might be a hot take. I don't know. But yeah, I don't think Yamato has much viability. Your Shanks matchup seems shocking because they're nice and defensive. Your Teach matchup might be okay, but like you can't use Onami to give the banish, so I'm not so sure. I'm just going to put her at the bottom of Rogue. I know people like Yamato. I just don't really understand why. Reiju, I think, is a better deck. I think she'll be near the top of Rogue. I do think Robin and Reiju you could probably interchange. These are about the same level. I think she's worse than Katakuri. Your on plays being negated by Teach is shocking. Yes, you can use the Baby Within Smokes. No, you can't draw 2 off Big Ray. Can't game Rush with Ichiji. Can't bounce anything with Niji. Can't do Porsche. I think this is really bad into Teach. And your other matchups are mostly unchanged. Your Lucci matchup was never good. Your Dofi matchup was never very good. I think your Shanks matchup would be pretty bad going forwards. I think Rogue is an appropriate place, but she's definitely one of these stronger decks in Rogue inherently. Just I don't think the matchups are there. Dragon, because he's only here because I put up a video on Dragon. I think if you want to play Dragon, you should probably just play like Sanji. I think he's broadly better. And something like Shanks is definitely miles better than Dragon. But Dragon's a ton of fun, and you know what? He can probably go maybe above Zoro, honestly. Yeah, Dragon can go above Zoro. He's not that bad. He's not that bad. He just doesn't have the longevity that these top decks do. Moria, I think, is Rogue. There's not a great amount of reason to play Moria at the moment. We are getting Moria buffs next set, which I'm kind of hyped for. I don't know if it will make a huge difference, but, you know, any buffs to this guy, I'm here for it. He's one of my favourite decks. But I think he's just way worse than Lucci, obviously. I do think he's also considerably worse than Luffy and Smoker. Just because he's not gained anything. He's not gained anything. The loss of Great Eruption was huge for this deck. This deck was crazy with Great Eruption. Without it, it's tough. It's a tough world out there. Boa, this might be a hot take, but I think Boa is a reasonably strong deck in this meta. Raging Tiger and Red Rock do a lot of heavy lifting, right? Raging Tiger's great into Dofi, it's great into Purple Luffy. Both of them are great into Teach. You're not super reliant on plays. Yes, you play Jinbei, but having those events to drag the game out, draw cards, really good. Kaido, obviously you might not get his on play, but he's just a massive guy, right? And Red Rock is also really nice into Shanks, who is the other new leader. Your Dofi matchup's going to be tough. Your Lucci matchup is still going to be horrendous. But I think into a lot of these other decks, BY, your BY matchup's great. I do think Boa has a little bit of promise. I'm probably not going to play much Boa, but if you're a Boa fan, I'd say give her a go. I don't think she's too bad. Foxy, I don't know how the fuck this made. Was it top 16 twice in Japan? This deck's terrible. Like, I think it's probably better than these because at least into Dofi you're pretty good because you have that 7-cost Foxy. It's just really crazy powerful into them, and freezing their leader is pretty wild because they need that when attacking. But outside of Dofi, like, your Teach matchup's terrible. You don't get any of your own plays. Your Purple Luffy matchup doesn't seem great. Your Lucci matchup has always been just disgustingly bad. I think your Shanks matchup is very tough. Them playing their big Shanks is really bad. Your Bonnie matchup's bad because they can rest your guys that you don't want them to attack, like Itamimizu, like Pickles, maybe. Just your little guys that fulfill that leader requirement, but don't do much attacking of themselves. Bonnie can rest them with the leader effect, and that's enough. That is enough. I don't know how this topped, but I think it has some level of validity, purely because it's pretty good into Doe. Vegapunk and Marco, these are the two decks that sort of popped off last format, kind of unexpectedly. I think Marco is going to be the better of the two. I'm going to put him above Reiju. I think this is broadly worse Shanks. But, you know, there's something to be said for the Sanji combo. Obviously, you can't do it into Teach, but into these other decks you can. Marco never had a too crazy leader matchup spread, but I didn't really gain anything from this set. The red cards were mostly just focused on Shanks. Maybe you could play the Rayleigh blocker. Maybe you could play 10 cost Roger or Shanks. They don't seem to synergize very well with it. And the blue cards are all just cross-skilled. So I do think Marco is going to be a good bit weaker this set. Just because of other decks getting buffed. And that Teach matchup, honestly, is not great. You don't get your Rayleigh effect. You don't get your Sanji effect. You don't get your Ivankov effect. You don't get any of your stackers like your Dofi blocker or your Perona or your Duval. I do think Marco's going to struggle, but I still think the deck's fine. The deck is decent. And that's why I'm putting it at the top of Rogue. Vegapunk. I'm just going to put Vegapunk here with Foxy. I think this deck's a good bit weaker than it was last set. I don't see much reason to play this anymore. There's other decks that beat Dofi. If you just want to beat Dofi, you can play Enel. You could play, like, Lucci is fine. There's decks that beat Dofi. You don't have to do this to yourself. Yes, it's very funny when Blackbeard if Blackbeard uses a trigger, it negates your leader, and then he can attack. That is one of the funniest new interactions. But outside of that, I'm just not seeing it. I don't think this deck is great. I think you're going to struggle into Teach. I think you're going to struggle into Shanks. They're just good decks, and Vegapunk really isn't a good deck. Without his on-plays, the Teach matchup gets pretty shocking. And the Shanks matchup, they can just go really long, slow you down, play out those big Shanks, negate all your little dudes down. Not great. It's not great. So that's my tier list. Let me know what you think. I think this is broadly uncontroversial. This is ordered completely. I do think Doflamingo is the best deck and Yamato is the worst deck. Of the ones that we've ranked, there's probably some other decks that you could maybe put at the bottom of Rogue here. But I think this is pretty good. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know where I'm wrong. If you did enjoy this, please drop me a subscribe. We had a Purple Luffy video yesterday. Tomorrow, I don't know. Let me know if you've got any requests for tomorrow. I've had a request for Nico Robin. Need to cook with that a bit more yet. But either way, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.